Hegel is one of those philosophers people often respect before they understand, and sometimes without ever understanding at all. His reputation arrives first. He is treated as profound, difficult, almost unavoidable if you want to speak seriously about philosophy, history, or modern thought. Entire traditions define themselves through him, either by following him or trying to escape him. And because of that, there's a strange pressure around Hegel. If he sounds incomprehensible, many assume the problem must be them. That assumption protects the system, because complexity can create authority. When language becomes dense enough, obscurity starts to look like depth. Contradictions sound intentional. Vagueness feels profound. People hesitate to say something does not make sense because they suspect they are missing a higher level of logic. Hegel benefits from this more than almost any major philosopher. To be fair, he is not simply hiding emptiness behind difficult words. He is trying to describe something genuinely difficult. How reality changes through contradiction. How ideas develop through conflict. How history is not a random sequence of events, but a process in which consciousness gradually becomes aware of itself. He wants philosophy to explain movement, not just static truths. Instead of asking what things are, he asks how they become what they are. That ambition is real, and it matters. Most simple systems fail because they freeze reality into fixed categories. Hegel sees that life does not work like that. Identities change. Institutions evolve. Beliefs transform through opposition. You do not understand freedom by defining it once and protecting the definition forever. You understand it by watching how it emerges through struggle, failure, and revision. This is one of his strongest insights. Contradiction is not always a flaw. Sometimes it is the engine of development. A person becomes who they are not by remaining internally consistent at every stage, but by confronting tensions they cannot ignore. A society changes because its own principles generate conflicts it must respond to. Progress is not clean. It moves through friction. That idea is powerful. The problem begins when this insight expands into a total system that claims to explain nearly everything. Because Hegel does not stop at saying contradiction matters. He turns contradiction into the structure of reality itself. Thought, history, politics, selfhood, all of it becomes part of a grand dialectical movement where each stage contains its own negation and resolves into something higher. The pattern becomes universal. And this is where things start to slip. Because once every event can be interpreted as part of a necessary dialectical process, the theory becomes extremely difficult to challenge. Whatever happens can be explained after the fact as another moment in development. If conflict occurs, it proves contradiction is real. If stability occurs, it becomes a temporary synthesis. If the system moves forward, the theory is confirmed. If it appears to regress, that too can be reframed as part of a larger unfolding. A theory that explains everything begins to risk explaining nothing. Because explanation requires limits. It requires the possibility that something could count against the framework. But Hegel's system is so flexible, so abstract, that almost any outcome can be absorbed into it. The dialectic becomes less like a precise method and more like a language for redescribing whatever already happened. This creates a serious problem. It becomes hard to tell whether the theory is revealing structure or simply imposing one. Are we discovering that history really unfolds dialectically? Or are we taking messy events and forcing them into a pattern because the pattern is intellectually satisfying? Once the system becomes broad enough, interpretation starts to replace evidence. This is where many people feel Hegel becomes almost untouchable and strangely empty at the same time. The language sounds immense. Spirit, negation, sublation, historical necessity. Everything feels connected to everything else. But when you ask what exactly this predicts, what exactly it rules out, the clarity begins to disappear. The system gestures toward total understanding, but often leaves ordinary understanding behind. Even his writing contributes to this. Hegel rarely gives you the clean precision people associate with rigorous philosophy. He moves through concepts by transformation rather than definition. Terms shift as the argument develops. Meaning emerges contextually rather than being fixed at the start. Defenders say this is necessary because reality itself is dynamic. Critics say it allows confusion to hide inside movement. Both are partly true, but for anyone trying to use philosophy as a guide rather than a ritual of interpretation, the problem becomes practical. If understanding requires endless reinterpretation of a total system, then the system risks becoming self-contained. You are no longer clarifying reality. You're learning how to speak Hegel. And once philosophy becomes a language game where mastery is measured by fluency in abstraction rather than clarity of thought, suspicion becomes justified. Because philosophy should make the world sharper, not blur it into a grand fog of significance. This is where the criticism lands hardest. Hegel may have identified something important about contradiction and development, but he wrapped it inside a structure so total, so elastic, and so conceptually overloaded that the insight often disappears beneath the machinery. Instead of clarifying change, the system can turn change itself into an excuse for saying almost anything with enough confidence. That is when complexity stops being depth and starts becoming protection. And that is why for many people, Hegel does not feel profound. He feels like philosophy made so complicated that it risks becoming meaningless. The deeper problem appears when Hegel's system moves from being a way of interpreting change to a claim about necessity. It is one thing to say that history often develops through conflict and contradiction. That is a strong observation, and in many cases it is clearly true. It is another thing entirely to say that these contradictions unfold according to an intelligible rational structure, as if history itself is moving toward a kind of completion. This is where Hegel becomes far more ambitious and far more vulnerable. He does not merely describe events. He suggests that reason is embedded in the movement of history itself, that what appears chaotic is actually part of a larger development of freedom and self-consciousness. Human institutions, political struggles, revolutions, even failures, all become moments in a process that is not random, but intelligible. History is not just happening, it is becoming. At first, this sounds powerful because it gives events meaning beyond the immediate. Suffering is no longer only suffering. Conflict is no longer only destruction. They become stages in a larger unfolding. A society breaks apart, but perhaps that collapse is the necessary condition for a higher form of order. An old structure fails, but maybe it had to fail because its own contradictions made it unstable. The pain is not meaningless because it belongs to development. This gives philosophy enormous explanatory reach, but it also creates enormous danger. Because once you start treating history as rational in this sense, you begin to justify outcomes by their place in the process rather than by their immediate human cost. What matters is no longer simply whether something is cruel, oppressive, or destructive, but whether it can be interpreted as necessary within the larger movement of spirit, freedom, or historical development. That move can become morally evasive. It allows suffering to be absorbed into abstraction. Instead of confronting injustice directly, you risk redescribing it as a transitional moment in progress. Instead of asking whether a system should be resisted, you ask what role it plays in the dialectic. Real people disappear behind conceptual necessity. This is not a small problem, because the moment philosophy starts treating human pain as historically functional, it becomes dangerously easy to confuse explanation with justification. To say something emerged through contradiction is not the same as saying it should have happened, or that those who suffered under it were merely participating in some rational process. Hegel's defenders often argue that this is a misunderstanding, that describing historical development does not mean morally approving every stage of it. But the structure still creates temptation. If the real truth of an event lies in its place within the total process, then immediate moral judgment begins to look superficial, almost naive compared to the larger philosophical view. That is a dangerous kind of intelligence, because it trains people to look past the concrete in search of the universal. And in doing so, it can reduce moral seriousness rather than deepen it. Philosophy becomes too comfortable explaining why things had to happen and not careful enough asking whether they should have been accepted at all. There's also a practical issue with the idea of historical necessity itself. It is usually much clearer in retrospect than in the present. After an event happens, especially something large like a revolution or the collapse of a political order, people become very good at telling stories about why it was inevitable. Contradictions were building. Structures were unstable. The outcome now appears rational. But before it happened, the future was uncertain, contingent, and shaped by countless decisions that could have gone differently. Hegel's system often makes hindsight look like destiny. It turns messy contingencies into necessary stages. The danger is that interpretation becomes too smooth. History looks more coherent than it actually was because the system prefers intelligibility over genuine uncertainty. We start reading inevitability into events that were, at the time, fragile and unpredictable. This makes the theory feel stronger than it is, because a framework that can explain outcomes after they occur is not necessarily one that truly understands them. It may simply be excellent at reconstruction. The dialectic can become a retrospective storytelling machine, finding rational patterns in events that were never governed by such clean necessity in the first place. And once that happens, the theory becomes strangely insulated from failure. If every outcome can be reinterpreted as part of the process, then what could disprove it? What event would count as evidence against the dialectic rather than just another expression of it? Without that boundary, the theory starts to function less like philosophy and more like a worldview that survives by absorbing contradiction rather than being challenged by it. Ironically, a philosophy built around contradiction becomes almost impossible to contradict. That should make people cautious, because intellectual systems are strongest when they tell you not only how they work, but where they could be wrong. Hegel's framework often feels too large for that. It does not simply offer arguments. It offers a total perspective, one where disagreement itself can be interpreted as another moment within the system. And that is often where frustration begins. You're no longer debating a claim. You're standing inside a structure that has already made room for your objection. The theory remains intact because it is designed to metabolize resistance. Criticism becomes evidence of dialectical tension rather than a genuine threat to the framework. At that point, philosophy starts to feel less like inquiry and more like architecture. Impressive, complex, and strangely difficult to escape. And when a system reaches that stage, people begin to ask the obvious question. Is this revealing reality or just protecting itself from being proven wrong? The final problem with Hegel is not simply that he is difficult, but that difficulty itself becomes part of the authority. The system feels deep because it is hard to hold in your head all at once. It promises totality, a way of understanding self, society, politics, history, and consciousness as parts of one movement. That scale is seductive. It makes smaller philosophies look narrow by comparison. Why settle for local explanations when someone offers the structure of reality itself? But total explanations come with a hidden cost. The larger the system becomes, the easier it is for clarity to disappear inside it. Concepts stop functioning like tools and start functioning like atmosphere. Spirit, negation, mediation, sublation, recognition, historical necessity. Each term points somewhere, but the accumulation creates a strange effect where understanding becomes inseparable from accepting the vocabulary. If you do not already think in the system's language, the system appears profound simply because it is inaccessible. That should always trigger suspicion. A philosophy should be difficult because reality is difficult, not because obscurity protects the philosopher. Complexity is justified only when it produces sharper understanding. If the result of reading a system is mostly the feeling that something important must be there, rather than clear insight into what is there, then reverence has replaced comprehension. Hegel often lives in that space. People defer to him because he must mean more than they can immediately grasp. Entire academic traditions are built on that assumption. But once philosophy becomes a status hierarchy where opacity is treated as evidence of seriousness, the discipline starts rewarding performance rather than thought. Saying something in a difficult way becomes safer than saying something clearly, because clarity can be tested. Obscurity cannot. This is why Hegel creates such divided reactions. For some, he is the philosopher who finally explains movement, contradiction, and history without reducing them to simple formulas. For others, he is the perfect example of how philosophy can become self-protective, where every confusion is interpreted as proof of depth rather than a sign that the system may be unstable. Both reactions exist because there is truth in both. Hegel did identify something important. Reality is not static. People, institutions, and ideas do change through conflict. Contradictions are not always mistakes. Sometimes they are the very mechanism through which development happens. Freedom is not a fixed possession, but something historically shaped and constantly renegotiated. These insights matter, and modern thought would be poorer without them. But those insights do not require the full machinery. You can recognize the importance of contradiction without turning history into a metaphysical drama. You can understand development without assuming it follows a hidden rational destiny. You can think seriously about change without pretending every event belongs to a necessary unfolding of spirit. Hegel's strongest ideas survive better when removed from the system that tries to make them universal. That is the real criticism. The problem is not that Hegel says nothing. It is that he says something important, then builds so much around it that the original insight risks disappearing. Instead of helping thought move, the system becomes so heavy that it begins to trap thought inside itself. You spend more time interpreting the architecture than looking at the world. Philosophy should do the opposite. It should return you to reality with sharper perception, not recruit you into a conceptual empire where everything must be translated into one grand structure. When a theory becomes so complete that it can explain every outcome, absorb every objection, and justify every complexity as necessary, it stops being disciplined by the world outside it. And once that happens, meaning starts to dissolve. Because if everything fits, then nothing is specific enough to matter. If every contradiction confirms the theory, contradiction no longer teaches you anything. If every event is part of the dialectic becomes another name for history rather than an explanation of it. At that point, complexity is no longer serving understanding. It is replacing it. The wiser position is not to dismiss Hegel entirely, but to separate the living insight from a dead system. Keep the recognition that change matters, that contradiction can generate development, that freedom is historical rather than abstract. But reject the temptation to turn those insights into a total map of reality. Not everything needs to be dialectical. Not every conflict is a stage in progress. Not every difficult sentence contains hidden wisdom. Sometimes something is unclear because it is profound, and sometimes it is unclear because it should have been said better. Hegel too often lives in the space where people stop asking that question. That is why he feels so important, and also why many people walk away with the same suspicion. Philosophy became so complicated that it stopped explaining life and started demanding faith in its own complexity. That is where depth ends and meaninglessness begins.